Okay. I think there's still quite a few people joining at this moment. This is very exciting. But I think I'll start with a very general introduction. And first and foremost, a heartfelt welcome to everyone here who's joining us for this SAGS roundtable, Ecofeminisms, Critical Perspectives on Theory and Activism. Welcome. My name is Dominique Rissard. I'm the Vice President of the Swiss Association of Gender Studies, who's, this association who's hosting this roundtable. The roundtable is conceptualized and organized by SAGS board members Bettina Dennerlein, Professor of Gender Studies and Islamic Studies and Deputy Director of the Institute of Asian and Oriental Studies at the University of Zurich, and Sébastien Jobin, Associate Professor at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lausanne and co-president together with Véronique Boyer of PLAGE, Plateforme Interfacultaire en Études Genre. A big thank you to you both for making this timely and topical event happen with all these illustrious guests, which is very exciting from all over the world with different perspectives. Welcome and thank you for being here. Thank you also for the technical support at the University of Zurich, my fellow, and the invaluable Secretary of SAGS, Helena Rust. Please allow me to say just a few words about SAGS. First of all, we're a scientific association. Our aim is to promote gender studies in Switzerland and to represent its interest in Swiss higher education. SAGS also offers a forum for exchange and networking. For those who would like to become a member, please visit our website, genregeschlecht.ch. And for the spontaneous folks among you, please join us at our hybrid members assembly tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. at the University of Neuchâtel or online. As I said, we do a lot of exchange and networking, and we have these how I think interesting and content-wise interesting research networks. And our newest research network, Gender and Political Science, will kick off their network with an event on feminist political science as a bulwark against anti-feminist politics on November 18th at the University of Basel. You're kindly invited. Check out our other research networks on critical masculinity studies, affect and cultural studies, and Marxism and decoloniality to be found on our website. They're all interested in welcoming new faces and members, so, don't be shy. Then we have a book series, Gender Issues, that regularly publishes exciting and innovative scholarship. Most recently, the anthology Violent Times, Rising Resistance. If you happen to know about a manuscript, please feel free to send it our way. And finally, keep your eyes open for the call for paper for next year's International SAGS Conference, Gendered Labor, to be held at the University of Lausanne, together with PLAGE, from September 14 to 15, 2023. And with that, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Sébastien and Bettina, the chairs of this roundtable or webinar. Thank you, and I'm very excited for a bit of controversial discussion.
Thank you very much, Dominique. So you already introduced us. I was going to say I'm Sébastien Chauvin, and I'm Associate Professor at University of Lausanne Center for Gender Studies. I'm a board member of SAGS, and I'll be chairing this panel together with Bettina Dennerlein. And perhaps Bettina wants to introduce herself as well, or reintroduce herself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Dominique, first of all, for this general welcome in the name of the Swiss Association for Gender Studies. And let me extend also a very warm welcome to everyone here who joins us, especially to our distinguished panelists. As you already said, I teach gender studies and Middle East studies at the University of Zurich, and well, I'm especially also involved in building Swiss Arab networks in the field of gender and diversity studies, which also I think is partly what brings me to the topic of ecofeminisms. And if you allow, Sebastian, I will briefly say something on why we put this panel together, and then hand back over to you to introduce the panel. Actually, since we were, thinking about this roundtable on ecofeminisms, critical perspectives on theory and practice, and we might perhaps want to add critical perspectives from theory and practice, the multiple crises we continue to experience are leading to dramatic increases in social inequalities, climate change, and global asymmetries, not least along gendered lines. So we felt and still feel it would be important to revisit a field of critical theory and activism that, since its very inception back in the late 1970s, has engaged with the various forms in which gender, environment, and globalization are interconnected. Ecofeminism is indeed a contested and conflictual field of theorization and politics. It consists of quite diverse, very different, partly overlapping, but also probably partly conflicting trends that range from more affirmative or gender maximizing attitudes towards nature, to new materialism or materialist feminism, critical science studies, not to mention post-humanist thought. And also it consists of intersectional de- or post-colonial stances that stress political and ethical concerns in the face of post- or decoloniality. And more specifically, we felt that critically situated analysis of the hegemonic politics, epistemologies, and representations of gendered environmental injustices could open up new perspectives on the current situation and new lines of inquiry, perhaps also new forms of alliances in feminist thought and feminist politics, in order to recast conceptual and political boundaries. And so I'm very much looking forward to the presentations and the discussion we are going to have. And I hand back the word to Sebastian, please.
Thank you, Bettina. So as Bettina said, this panel acknowledges that ecofeminism is a heterogeneous field of political practice and theorizing, that in many ways it has been a realm of emancipatory practice and praxis before being an academic set of theories. Also that it raises distinct issues in different world areas and their entanglements. And taking stock from this panel is today bringing together speakers and approaches that deploy and expand ecofeminist insights as critical tools of transformative knowledge and social transformation more generally, but also approaches and speakers that take critical stances towards some aspects of current ecofeminist projects. Bettina now is going to tell us about the organization of this panel, and then the speakers will have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. So what we plan to do, since we have a limited amount of time before us, so we will briefly introduce the speakers before they give their presentation. And we will then have a contribution by our discussant. After this contribution by the discussant, there will be responses by the panelists before we finally open the discussion to the public, to the audience, who is kindly invited to post questions in the chat.
Thank you, Bettina. So let me introduce now our first speaker, Geneviève Pruvost. Geneviève Pruvost is a researcher and a sociologist of gender, work, environmental struggles, and rural ways of life. She's the co-director of the master program in environmental humanities at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Following research on female appropriation of legal and illegal violence, she's been working on, but also with radical ecology over the past decade. Her last book is entitled Quotidien politique, Féminisme, Écologie et Subsistance. It was published in 2021. And her talk today is entitled Ecofeminist Conceptions of the Household as a Revolutionary Agora. And Geneviève, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your invitation, and I want you to apologize me for my bad English. So I will try to do my best. I would like to speak about households, but in French this is a different word, which is maisonnée, and it's really hard to translate it in English. So I will speak about households, but sometimes I will speak about domestic groups. So I will try to clarify all this at the end of my talk. But first of all, I want to speak from a specific ecofeminist perspective, which I called the subsistence feminism, which was invented at the end of the 70s, and maybe the last books were in the 90s, and it's a type of ecofeminism that is inspired by Marxism, anarchism, and it includes theories that don't identify themselves as ecofeminist, like Silvia Federici, but they actually all share a lot of the same ideas about gender relationships and capitalism. So I will speak about, I will try to summarize, but also to give my own perspective about the works of Françoise d'Aubonne, which is our French ecofeminist, that from my perspective is a subsistence feminist, but also Maria Mies, the German sociologist, with Veronica Benold-Thompson, who invented actually the concept of subsistence and promoted it in the 80s. But you also have their friend, Vandana Shiva, or their other friend, Silvia Federici, I talked to you earlier. So this type of feminist, ecofeminist position is based on a distinction between reproductive domestic work and productive domestic work. They actually come from this feminist background of the 70s, but they make a clear division, very clear and very queer, and we'll speak about it later, between consumer work, which is not only unpaid and poorly recognized, it's also a kind of work that is cut off from subsistence work. And so it's really hard to have the same word to define these very different economic operations. Consumer work is not subsistence work, because the work of assembling industrial consumer products is not based on the knowledge of the cycle of matters and living matters. And it's not based on the knowing of where the matters come from and where they go. And actually, you don't even have the power to have a direct action or even a knowledge, a personal knowledge of the whole chain and all the process of production. So in other words, buying a canned vegetable is in any case the same economic operation as making canned food from vegetables grown in one's own garden from the previous year's seeds you already produced. So in one case, it's not possible to have an exchangeable surplus and to adapt tools and production to your needs, and even to make small trades. So assimilating these two economic operations in the same big category of domestic work is very problematic. It trends to create the category of domestic work as universal in all places, in all times. So subsistence feminists want to denaturalize the notion of domestic work, but at the same time, the notion of family, of work, of household, and they contest the division between private and public life. The feminist group of the 70s, Wages for Housework, for example, is based on the provocative demand of a household wage on the grounds that purchasing and consuming is not a very enjoyable activity, and not and they also claim that working in labor in factory is not also something desirable. So for this kind of activism, working in a factory or working at home, making consumption work is industrial work. And so it's not something that should be a basis for gender emancipation. So for subsistence feminism, division of labor, a fairer division of labor in the factory, in the professional sphere, or in the political sphere, or on the domestic sphere, will not change the fact that modern domestic work and modern work in general is based on prefabricated industrial objects with no connection to the people and the environment who produced them. In other words, for subsistence feminism, it's very important to have a geopolitical and historical perspective on work. So they have a very large way of thinking. They speak, they always think of the very locally and historically situated organization of patriarchy. They cannot have like a general idea of patriarchy. So they think with hunter-gatherer societies, they think about a large and diverse range of peasant societies, and also with the idea that industrial societies are not the same all over the world. And they also have in common not to idealize socialists, the socialist option, or the etatization of production. So they, in other words, they don't follow the Communist Party at this time. So maybe I would like to give to start with the way they reread history, to show how they always have like a decolonial perspective, even if at this time this was not the word that was used. Let's start with their conception of emancipation in feudal age. Ivan Illich, who is also part of this group, it identifies a turning point in the 11th century. He speaks about the invention by the church of the norm of the couple, heterosexual couple and nuclear family. It becomes the unit of reference. And so the whole idea of this historical perspective is to show how capitalism will be based on a reduction of household to nuclear family, a heterosexual couple of two persons, instead of extended family domestic groups. And it will take like centuries to destroy these big households, but it will work at the end of the 20th century, at least in global north. So this reduction of households is really a condition to go from subsistence economy to the monetarization of exchanges. So it really prepares the birth of private life and also the appropriation of communal lands. So the village communal regime of collective property will give birth to private property. Artisan guilds of both sexes and the peasant subsistence economy will be dismantled in favor of laborers being put to work in urban cities. And I'm not going to tell you the interpretation of Silvia Federici of witch hunt that you know, and I don't have that much time, but vernacular knowledge of herbalism, childbirth, abortion, and contraception will be disqualified and appropriated by specialized professions. So the other interesting theoretical part of this kind of ecofeminism is also to show that the invention of a specialized system of professions cut off from a territory is actually will play a key role in the development of capitalism. The academia certifications, academic certifications will replace vernacular knowledge, and what can be an architect, an engineer, doctor anywhere with supposedly universal knowledge and also following standard protocols helped by the industrial process. So the process of destroying vernacular knowledge, but also extended domestic groups based on subsistence economy will make actually subsistence work more difficult, because in the transition from peasant society to capitalism, there is a special time when actually women still do subsistence work, when men will work in the cities in factories. And so men will work outside home or outside villages or small cities. And so housework will and subsistence work will be done or made by a tiny, a reduced community. And so actually it will really help also the assimilation of technology as emancipatory, because when you don't have enough arms to do everything that has to be done, actually you really want more electricity, more nuclear power plants, and more robots, and so on. So you have like historian of techniques who really try to investigate this passage from collective domestic and subsistence work to individualized and actually also female specialized work, which makes it really harder. So this also to this kind of rewriting history, which is very different from the classic feminist history, is also pointing out the key role played by slavery in colonies, and also the localization of industrial factories in ex-colony, where you can find exactly the same process of rural exodus, women finding themselves alone, making free subsistence work, and the economic analysis of this moment shows that in a very short time, capitalism needs this free subsistence work because it allows to pay less the workers in colonies and ex-colonies. So a second step is reached when subsistence work that is freely made in this what we will call now a global south becomes an obstacle to the extension of consumption society. So it becomes something that actually will which needs to be destroyed in some way, so that women can enter and become also workers with wages, meaning working for money and not working for subsistence, common subsistence. So the entry of women into the wage economy in the same way as men, but less paid, of course, constitutes another step for the installation of capitalist development on in global south, but also after global north, by converting the whole population to the military economy and to this very strange work, which is simplified consumption work. Since now, in order to live, to make a living, it's like an enormous anthropological turn. We need 2 adults who are paid in order for them to buy basic goods. This big evolution will totally change home, which is not an economic unit, but which will become a sphere of affective and educational care, which means these very strange things, that care will be and is detached from, is severed from subsistence work, as if making subsistence and taking care of people could be separated or abstracted. So actually, in terms of environmental care, when you create a care which is not anchored in a direct relationship to your environment, actually, how can you have environmental care? Because it actually requires a day-to-day concern. So to make it short, this very panoramic and simplified historical process that is detailed by different researchers and different activists like Silvia Federici, Maria Mies, or Vandana Shiva, or other historians also. In other words, access to land, access to a workshop, access to a field, access to interdependent households seem very archaic. It's not even a demand in democracy. Citizenship, equality, freedom are totally severed from the right to get means of livelihood. This demand is considered as backward. So it's quite a tough task for this kind of ecofeminist activism to reclaim something that look really backward. And I would like to actually, for me, I had to look very closely to this kind of theories because actually I could see in my sociological surveys a lot of activists that would reclaim lands, would reclaim manual work, manual knowledge, and as something that is totally part of freedom and equality, and also of the emancipatory promise of democracy. So I had to, since a lot of these people that lived day to day very ecologically, and also were really involved in struggles against big equipments or big destruction of environment, I could see that they had a very another conception of family. Actually, the word family is not the right word. They had like political households where the collective and daily participation on making food, clothing, housing, heating was the major subject of debate and conversation. And also it implied that they could not separate activist and political demonstration, I mean classical demonstration, to the fact that they would share collectively and the task, the vital task and the crucial task of making their subsistence every day. So it's the materiality of work and with hands became a statement in itself. The fact that they could trace the transformation of matters, living matters to objects, was really something that became more very, very important, and actually even the precondition of every activist move. So how can we define household? Redefine household? It's a collective place of work, more based in co-residency than kinship, of course. So this is why I actually like all the words with home, because it's actually give a territorial base on relationships instead of insisting on kinship, right? I mean, so it doesn't mean there are not people who are related, relatives, because some of them are parents, but not all of them. But it also creates, I mean, it also means that sharing the same spaces, sharing the same tools, and also sharing the same concern for a little portion of land, it can be in cities or in countryside, is actually the reason why these people are together. And their major concern is actually not the reproduction of work, but the reproduction of subsistence, so that everybody can work together and live together. So it means actually in this kind of household that everybody is a member of the household. It can be animals, it can be spirits also, it can be objects. It means really not everybody bear children or even raise children or even have the same age. So when I could see this kind of households, I could also see that in the anthropological literature on they could also define households the same way, you know, like a co-working space. Based not based on profits, not based on the extension of the power of this kind of group, but on the reproduction, mere reproduction of the fact of living together and being concerned by the same territory. So for me, the democratization of, I mean, to have this kind of conception of households can really enlarge our vision of activism in destroying the artificial division between public and private sphere, or also the artificial division between productive work and reproductive work. Because in this kind of households, the major concern is also the right distribution of work that has to be done, because if it's not done, you die, or plants are dying, animals are dying. So you have to always be concerned about the work that has to be done. So the work that has to be done has to be shared. Mariami has a very interesting concept. She speaks about sweat equity, and I really like this word. It means that it's a hard labor to take care of all these fields, animals, and younger people, older people, but also and it's not always fun, and it requires sweat. And the problem is when you dedicate one gender or one part of the population in Global South to do this sweaty work instead of you. So there is something very important in sweat equity. And if not, you are in the patriarchal organization of households and the capitalist also conception of divided households. I don't know how long I have. I think it is the hand.
It should be now, yeah, soon.
Yeah, so
already.
Maybe a last sentence. What I want to say is that in this conception of households that you could also call co-residency or subsistence, common subsistence work, or you could also call it cooperation, you know, in order to get common subsistence. It's might sound like something that could be a way to close relationships to small territories. So what I also observed in my field work is that all these households are based on people who are very localized and centered to common subsistence, but a little part of the group is nomadic. So what I want to say is that this very localized, relocalized conception of work is totally intertwined with a very a nomadic way of being that actually allows people who cannot get along actually with the group, and allows also this domestic group not to remain oppressive, because there are some violent ties you want to get rid of. So for me, this extremely relocalized way of being is totally intertwined with the extreme possibility of being nomadic.
Thank you very much, Geneviève, for this exciting panorama of subsistence feminism and the very nice conclusion. I will let Bettina introduce our second speaker.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm happy to present Fatima Alvarez Castillo, our second speaker of today. Fatima Alvarez Castillo is a social scientist and a professor of political science at the University of the Philippines, Manila. She's a member of the Philippine Health Research Ethics Board, the country's policy-making body on research ethics. And she also provides expertise on research ethics and gender justice in capability building for NGOs, indigenous peoples organizations, as well as faculty researchers in various universities. And Fatima Alvarez Castillo has published widely in her field of expertise and holds many prestigious positions in boards and as an invited researcher and professor. So please, Fatima, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bettina, Sebastian, and all the people who work hard to put up this very exciting roundtable. Thank you so much, especially to Dominic Folger for assisting me during my presentation with my PowerPoints. I cannot see their names, but I suppose some of my students are here. Yes. And I would like to make special mention of them, despite that I have not required them actually to attend, and it is almost midnight here in the Philippines. So I would like to make special mention of them, and I would like to acknowledge my key informant who helped me develop the key ideas for this lecture, Kakay Tolentino, who is a woman leader of the Dumagat indigenous peoples living in the Sierra Madre Mountain. Next, please. Dominic, can we have the next slide?
Sorry, something doesn't work.
Oh.
Give me a second.
Okay, it's okay. While Dominic is trying to fix that, okay, I just would like to say that that was an exciting lecture by on a very difficult topic on theorizing ecofeminism. So I'll now proceed with my lecture. Thank you, Dominic. In December 2020, in Central Philippines, in 5 villages of indigenous people, 9 men leaders were murdered by government security forces in their homes. 16 were arrested on trumped-up charges. 6 of these are women. Marivic Aguirre, who 6 years ago spoke in a conference that I organized, went missing for several days. She later turned up with signs of torture. The victims have been leading the opposition to a big dam that will destroy the ecosystem of their ancestral land. Up till now, no one has been made to answer for any of these brutalities. Next slide, please. In India, where Adivasi communities have organized in defense of their ancestral land, teacher Soni Sori was arrested in 2011 on charges of acting as a conduit for the Maoists. During her imprisonment, she was tortured and sexually assaulted by the police. Next slide, please. According to international NGO Global Witness, majority of the killings of environmental defenders took place in Colombia, Mexico, and the Philippines, mostly carried out by hitmen and the military. When neoliberalism became a global system sponsored by capitalist powers led by the United States, beginning in the 1970s, the exploitation of local natural resources intensified. It was not coincidental that development aggression became more intense. This is why there has been increased and widespread violations of indigenous people's rights. Storytelling is a powerful tool that is central in the survival of Homo sapiens. For how could our ancestors have learned about the use of fire if storytelling was not invented? I will use storytelling in this presentation. The first story is of the Igorot in the Cordillera, northern Philippines. Next slide, please. In 1970, during the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos, the World Bank approved funding for the construction of 4 mega dams in the Chico River in the Cordillera. This would displace about 100,000 indigenous peoples and submerge several villages, including ancestral burial grounds. There was no consultation with the people. Deception, coercion, and bribery were the state's response to the people's refusal of the project. Next slide, please, Dominic. Makliing Dulag, a peace pact holder, the term for that in Cordillera is Budong, was the unifying leader of the resistance. His words have been widely quoted. It was reported, for example, that when an army engineer asked for titles to their ancestral land, Makliing Dulag replied, "You ask us if we own the land and mock us, where is your title?" Such arrogance of owning the land when you shall be owned by it. How can you own that which will outlive you? He said, the question of the dam is more than political. The question is life, our Kalinga life. Apo Kabunyian, the Lord of us all, gave us this land. It is sacred, nourished by our sweat. It shall become even more sacred when it is nourished by our blood. When an emissary of Marcos came with an envelope, Makliing told him, that envelope perhaps contains either two things, a letter or money. If it is a letter, I don't know how to read. If it is money, I have nothing to sell. Go and take your envelope with you. About the resistance, let me read from a narrative of a young participant. Despite the people's refusal, the government went on with a physical survey of where they were going to construct the dam, while our people went on with the meetings and consultations with other villages to discuss and plan how we are going to oppose the construction of the dam. At first, we sent petitions and delegations to the president to express our opposition. The president did not respond. Instead, more men came back. This time, they were in fatigue uniforms and carrying guns. They had with them big construction equipment and materials. They came to start the construction of the dam. Our people and the people from other villages forged peace pacts through our traditional systems and united to oppose the dam. We kept vigil at night and barricaded the sites. Men, women, and children were all involved. We took turns in cooking, planting, keeping vigil, and watching over the barricades. Almost everyone in the villages affected were mobilized. But after several days, the soldiers brought back the equipment that we had confiscated and brought to the military barracks. When we learned about this, some women asked the men to stop what they were doing. The men did not listen to them, so the women dismantled the tents themselves. This was the start of a long period of active resistance by the people against the dam, where women played key and important roles. Next slide, please. Tetra Makliing, who was then a young mother, was one of the leaders of the women who used their bodies to block the road to prevent trucks from reaching the construction. One time, our narrator continues, during the height of the struggle, women tried to prevent the entry of a truck that was bringing in more construction materials. We laid down on the road so that the trucks would not be able to pass. When they tried to bring the materials down from the truck, others tried to physically struggle with the men. The men were becoming more aggressive. Many among us were hurt. We cried, but at the same time, we fought back and kicked them. All the women who were there did what they thought was best. In desperation, one woman removed her clothes. Others followed. They bared their breasts to the soldiers, many of whom were also fellow indigenous peoples. One lactating mother squeezed out milk from her breast to prevent a soldier from getting near her. To the men in the Cordillera, this is a terrible shame, for it is like insulting one's own mother. The soldiers stopped what they were doing and went back to their barracks. On the evening of April 24, 1980, Makliing Dulag was murdered in his home by members of the Philippine Army. Next, please. Makliing's death was a watershed in the indigenous people's struggle in the Philippines and around the world. According to our young narrator, many of our villagers, including women, joined in the armed resistance. It was said that when non-violent resistance is impossible, armed resistance becomes inevitable. The second story is that of Bai Bibiaon of the Manobo. Next, please. Bai Bibiaon is the only female chieftain in the history of the Manobo people and has been called Mother of the Lumads. Lumad is the exonym, the collective term for indigenous peoples in Mindanao. She is now 83 years old. When she was in her 50s, she was at the forefront of the fight against a big logging company in defense of the Pantaron mountain range, the ancestral lands of the Manobo. Next, please. When the logging company began cutting trees, the tribe issued a warning. When the warning went unheeded, under the leadership of Bai Bibiaon and her male colleague, Chief Dato Gibang, the people launched a tribal war, a pangayaw, against the logging company. Bai Bibiaon was expert with a poisoned bow and arrow. The company backed out and the forest stood. But mining companies soon replaced the loggers, backed up by soldiers and Lumad men recruited into a paramilitary group. Bai Bibiaon now lives in an evacuation camp. Her people were forced off their lands by the military occupation in the name of counterinsurgency operations that actually served to facilitate land grabbing. If they return, many, especially leaders like Bai Bibiaon, will likely be killed by the army. If they remain, on the other hand, in the evacuation camp and lose their lands, they will die with nothing to leave behind. There is only one option: to fight back. From the evacuation camp, Bai Bibiaon continues to lead her people in protests and demand a safe return to their ancestral lands. A formidable figure, she has stood up to government officials and corporate representatives. She sees a universal thread uniting battles for defense of land throughout the world, especially when bound by an indigenous worldview. She said, "The protection of the mountain, the protection of our ancestral domain means the protection of all of humanity. So this is not only my struggle, but the struggle for my people and our struggle in defense of humanity." Next, please. Then there is the Chipko movement in India, also in the 1970s, that mostly involved rural peasant women in the Himalayan section of India. Chipko can be translated to mean embrace or hug, the strategy used by the women to prevent the trees from being cut. Initially led by men who were practitioners of Gandhi's nonviolent resistance, the Chipko movement developed as a peasant and women's movement for forest rights that included protests against dams, mining, and quarrying. some commentators refer to the Chipko movement as a prime example of ecofeminism. Next slide, please. I will now try to pull out a few threads to construct an analytic frame. First, I think we can say that the stories illustrate the dialectical links between mentality and action, between worldview and resistance, that one acts on the other and vice versa. For example, the belief in the spirituality of nature, that land is equivalent to life, are facets of indigenous worldview, which became historical material forces when these were actualized in the creativity and intensity of the people's resistance, indicating consciousness impacting resistance. Then, as my diagram attempts to show, on the other hand, vice versa, their experiences in the resistance, the practice, impacted their consciousness in, for example, a recognition that women have distinctive and crucial roles in the struggle. This recognition, this shift in consciousness, is for both the men and the women. This is for Petra Macleing and Bai Bibiaon too, who transformed from local into national women leaders of the indigenous peoples' movement that could not have happened had there been no consciousness change in both of them. When Igorot women decided at some point to join the armed struggle, as did many Manobo and Adivasi women in India, this signifies a radical shift in consciousness. This illustrates that change took place not because people wished it, but because they acted, transforming beliefs into material historical forces of change. Next slide, please. The stories suggest that if we wish to construct an analytic frame, we can perhaps start with selected principles from ecofeminism, indigeneity, and dialectical materialism that come together like a tapestry, and I will try to illustrate. While there are important divergences in theoretical ecofeminism, which Bettina has clearly pointed out at the opening of the program, I pull out two common positions. One is the rejection of capitalist Western mentality on the universal superiority of modernity and science. Two is rejection of the binary of nature and culture. These are core principles in the indigenous worldview also. How about dialectical historical materialism as a method for understanding change? I will use two assumptions. One, that contradictions lead to change, and two, everything changes. In other words, everywhere there is contradiction. Some are antagonistic, like the contradiction between the indigenous peoples and multinational corporations because their primary interests collide. When we place these principles together, we could have the beginnings of a tapestry, a frame, for seeing where is the place of indigenous women in theorizing about nature, women, and liberation. I will use this as takeoff for my last point, that while we should or we can generalize or theorize about women's oppression, we don't know as much about indigenous women's situation. I am not an expert on ecofeminist theorizing, but I sense that there is not much that is drawn from indigenous women's realities and histories. Next, please. And this is my last slide. Women professionals from the middle class, women workers in factories, women activists in my experience in rallies or mass action, do not carry their babies with them. It is only among the indigenous women at rallies that I witnessed this practice. So this photo shows a dumagat mother with her baby in a rally in the city, in the most major city in the Philippines, against the dams of the government and other issues of the dumagat in the Sierra Madre. The women expertly tie a piece of cloth around their shoulder and neck and place their babies inside. I am showing this because it strikes me as symbolic of the particular roles and place of indigenous women in the struggle for liberation, not only as biological mothers, but as nurturers who are able to unite resistance to nurturing. Because I don't have the time, we cannot anymore show you, Dominic and I, a video, a song that was composed by a Catholic priest in honor of his young dumagat friend who was murdered by the soldiers in the Philippines. But this photo of the mother and her baby was taken from that video. So what I can do is I can post the link to the video for everyone to see, and anyone who is interested to watch it can do that, of course. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for this important presentation, and that shows the productivity of looking into situated storytelling as a critical engagement with development aggression, and also into the violent forms that may evolve from this. Thank you so much. So I hand back the word to Sebastian to present our third speaker.
Thanks, Bettina, and I'll introduce our last speaker. And now, Sophie Lewis is a writer and a theorist living in Philadelphia. She holds degrees in human geography and English literature. Her work is radically rethinking human reproduction from a family abolitionist perspective. I once introduced her as Marxist feminism's enfant terrible, and she is the author of 2 books, Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, which appeared in 2019, and Abolish the Family, a manifesto for care and liberation, which just came out globally, and which I just finished and is really awesome. Her talk today is entitled From Xenofeminism versus Ecofeminism to Xecofeminism. And Sophie, I'm leaving you the floor.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sebastian. Thank you, Bettina, Dominique, Nolwenn, and everyone else involved in organizing this SAGS panel. I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Lenni Lenape people, as Sebastian said, from a private household in a settler colonial city known as Philadelphia. And the remarks I'm making today, like everything I write pretty much, are informed by a lifelong commitment to climate justice struggle, and also trans feminism, trans liberation, and what I would also, in the context of my anti-capitalist ecological writing collective, Out of the Woods, call quote unquote cyborg ecology. So basically, today I want to begin unpacking a proposal made about 4 years ago by the ecological theorist and political scientist Alyssa Battistoni, that we might move beyond the xenofeminism versus ecofeminism dichotomy towards something that Battistoni sort of playfully suggests we might call Zecofeminism. Quote, I don't think they have to be opposed, she wrote. I'm interested in working towards an eco-xenofeminism, brackets, Zecofeminism. In other words, an ecofeminism that's strange, monstrous, and alien, that's against nature with a capital N, in the sense of the given order of things, but interested in nature, with a lowercase n, as it actually exists in the world. So just to rephrase the distinction there being drawn, feminism can oppose nature in the sense of the given, while befriending, or at least according respectful attention, curiosity, and interest to natures, I would pluralize with a lowercase n, in the sense of the actually existing and evolving and mutating webs of non-human and more than human life on planet Earth. Okay, so I'll step back for a moment and quickly gloss, although we've had two speakers on ecofeminism already, but I will nevertheless quickly gloss ecofeminism and then also xenofeminism. So, as has been amply evoked already on this panel, ecofeminist theory and philosophy emerged in the 1970s in the context of anti-nuclear power movements and diverse environmentalisms, some of them much older and some of them relatively new. For instance, anti-military and anti-deforestation, land defense activisms, and so on. From Vandana Shiva and Maria Mies to Françoise Daubonne, and yes, Silvia Federici, there are different strains of ecofeminism. However, I believe the formation can be defined as a perspective that has been critical of the Western privileging of reason in the tradition of Cartesian dualism, a privileging that has resulted in the domination and exploitation of both non-human nature itself and people who have been historically positioned as closer to nature, specifically women and colonized or indigenous people. And on these grounds, ecofeminism has mounted an extremely important anti-patriarchal critique of capitalist science and technology, and a gendered account of ecocide. Ecofeminist principles thus either undergird or help us to explain why the planet we inhabit is so frequently imagined as quote unquote Mother Earth, or quote unquote a virgin frontier, or why one might decry the quote unquote rape of ecosystems, or why humans are called upon by environmentalists to quote unquote love your mother. Okay, xenofeminist thought, on the other hand, is much more recent in the sense that the term xenofeminism was only coined in 2015. And that's only a few years ago, obviously. But it is often suggested, and I want to suggest, that the publication of The Dialectic of Sex by Shulamith Firestone in 1970 was also an origin point for xenofeminism on account of that book's qualified openness to the possibility that technology, including infamously the automation of pregnancy, might one day play a role in the liberation of women and indeed the abolition for Firestone of the sex distinction itself. And true to this Firestonian insistence that there is much in nature that is downright violent, and that science and technology could, in theory at least, be seized by communist feminists and deployed to utopic rather than dystopic ends, xenofeminism utterly rejects the normative alignment of women with nature. It takes the view that, quote, to claim, this is from the Xenofeminist Manifesto by the Laboria Cubonics Collective of 2015, quote, to claim that reason or rationality is by nature a patriarchal enterprise is to concede defeat, unquote. From the xenofeminist's perspective, the valorization of the natural has overwhelmingly negative consequences. And the deployment of nature has been used to oppress countless populations throughout history: disabled and neurodivergent people, gender non-conforming and trans people, infertile people, the list goes on. If nature is unjust, as the famous xenofeminist slogan goes, change nature. Quote, reason wants to be free, and indeed, quote, rationalism itself must be a feminism. Okay, that's my brief gloss on ecofeminism and xenofeminism. So what would, or what might, a Zecofeminism be? It was in 2018, in the context of the very recent publication of Donna Haraway's monograph, Staying with the Trouble, on the one hand, and on the other, the reissuing of the Xenofeminist Manifesto by Verso Books, that Battistoni proposed this term, Zecofeminist, to denote what might best be described as a feminist method of skepticism vis-a-vis this putative binary, xeno versus eco. So while the formations that I've just glossed would seem to be, fairly explicitly opposed to one another, in fact, they emerged in a sense, in reaction to one another. Nevertheless, I think there is such a thing as a Zecofeminist. Indeed, I would suggest that the work of Donna Haraway, in a complex and sort of methodologically performative way, embodies that internally quarrelsome hybridization. So the two word roots, xenos and oikos, denote, of course, respectively, in their ancient Greek origins, the alien or the stranger in the case of xenos, as in xenophobia, and the family or the home in the case of oikos, as in economy or ecology. So what would it mean to trouble the distinction, or the opposition at least, between kinship and alienness, between foreignness and the domestic? In raising today this conceptual opposition between, again, strangeness and habitus, between the outsider and the home team, between the racial or the species other and the familiar people or the self or the national family, I'm obviously opening up an impossibly broad series of philosophical and political problematics. At the heart of debates within ecological thought, there's always been this question of nature's definitional agency, its wildness, its inhumanity, its strangeness, its otherness, but often in combination with claims about nature's fundamental familiarity, its healthfulness, its rightness as a source of lost belonging and unalienated identity. And at the heart of debates within feminism, too, perhaps it goes without saying, there has always been a materialist question about the means, whether that's natural, capitalist, heterosexist, colonial, masculinist, scientific, or otherwise, the means by which sex has been made binary and then naturalized as such. There's been a question of the historic processes by which labors that we call, quote unquote, reproductive, were first privatized and feminized inside the individual household as a form of primitive accumulation, kickstarting market society, rendering woman an other to the public sphere of thought, action, reason, and politics, and unattached, therefore, to reason, because attached to the private animal comforts of the sphere of the home. So allow me to name just two of the dialectical knots that jump out to me in all of this, because there are tensions in both sides, which I've perhaps already sort of gestured towards. If ecofeminism has often called on women to decolonize their imaginations and recognize their alliance with nature on the basis of an orientation toward the regeneration of life that is putatively shared with, with these non-human natures, and perhaps the females or, the feminized bodies of other species, as well as the Homo sapiens species, it also carries a contradictory tension in its simultaneous aspiration to make a pacific home or household or family, right? Oikos, where humanity is in right oikonomical partnership with non-human nature, right? And then at the same time, to de-domesticate, to de-domesticate and rewild interspecies relations in a spirit of feminist respect for the deeply unfamiliar and uncontrollable, the untamable sovereignty of Earth systems and animals, right? If I've managed to make clear, that's a tension I perceive within ecofeminism. And if xenofeminism has called on people of all genders to shake off the limitations of standpoint and particularism, to dare to totalize and in a fashion universalize, to reject the romanticization of the given in favor of a Promethean politics, it also carries a contradictory tension in its simultaneous aspiration to advance, in its own words, alienation, right? Xenos, via this relentlessly denaturalizing orientation to non-human nature and human nature alike. And then at the same time, to familiarize everything that is alien by bringing it under the compass of this mutational creativity and this politics, right? So for instance, quote, xenofeminists insist on the possibility of large-scale social change for all of our alien kin, unquote. That's in the Xenofeminist Manifesto. And alien kin is such an interesting oxymoron, isn't it? And in this way, intriguingly, the XF Manifesto identifies its method as a combination of, intriguingly, ontological naturalism and normative anti-naturalism. So the normative part is where, as I've already indicated, instead of calling for, an expansion of the definition of the natural, the manifesto declares nothing should be accepted as fixed, permanent, or given, neither material conditions nor social forms, unquote, right? But the ontological part is where they say, quote, to say that nothing is sacred, that nothing is transcendent or protected from the will to know, to tinker, and to hack, is to say that nothing is supernatural. Nature, understood here as the unbounded arena of science, is all there is, unquote. So in other words, there's nothing natural about nature, but at the same time, nature is the whole relationship and the whole situation of history, for better and for worse. So capitalism itself is not so much unnatural, even though it is anti-human, I think they would agree. But to paraphrase Jason Moore, capitalism is a way of organizing nature. And the challenge we face is to find a liberatory way. But not all aliens are comrades, right? And I would suggest that xenofeminists need to be clear that the large-scale social change they seek is not actually desirable for quote unquote all our alien kin, right? I think ecofeminism has been better perhaps at naming the enemy bodies, relationships, corporations, and social forms that, whether they are natural or not, are deadly and damaging vis-a-vis the flourishing of life in particular on Earth. But I think there is, funnily enough, a shared underemphasis in both xenofeminism and ecofeminism on the necessarily destructive side of any feminist movement. There's a hesitation, I'm suggesting, on what forms of life and anti-life, right? What productive yet anti-human relations it might be that feminists must destroy and unmake, rather than say, defend against, or on the other hand, embrace, hack, mutate, and so on. So I'm speaking here as someone who has long been interested in the buried utopian history of family abolition, by which I mean the deprivatization of care that might, or perhaps after all must, take place in the course of the overthrowing of capitalist society, given that the private nuclear household or family is the basic cell of capitalism's social tissue. And I'm speaking as well as someone who has long been fascinated by the combination of violence and xeno-hospitality that takes place at the molecular level in the arena of human gestational labor, i.e. human pregnancy, mediated by the hemachorial placenta. Ecofeminism may, in other words, have always been my secular religion. Perhaps I never learned the ideological boundaries well enough to know how to consciously transgress them, or to recognize that I was transgressing them in the first place. As a disloyal daughter of Donna Haraway, by which I mean a critical partisan of her deeply socialist and deeply ecological Cyborg Manifesto of 1984, and a loving critic of her anti-natalist multi-species work in the 21st century, that is no longer, or I would argue, at least no longer explicitly socialist, I come to these questions with a foundational confidence that biology is queer and messy and violent and unromantic, for both better and for worse, and that feminists need neither avoid nor fear nor reify, nor on some level give credence to the realm of the biological, about which we still know so very little. And whereas sometimes ecofeminist critiques blur the distinction between capitalism and socialism into a critique of industrialism or modernity, a blurring that was very much part of Haraway's inspiration when writing the Cyborg Manifesto, right, in the context of the sort of undialectically technophobic ecofeminisms of the early 80s. I come with a cyborgian sense that we are historically situated animals who have no choice but to confront our contaminated, historically manufactured, techno-saturated subject position. There is no turning back the clock. The machine, to quote Haraway, is us. Yet it is very hard to avoid a framework in which, to quote Haraway again, we think of machines as an it, over and against which our organic and internal cells have to conduct some kind of heroic struggle. So I'm a Harawavian, yet I also come to my teacher with a possibly paranoid reading approach, a relentlessly anti-fascist skepticism about the politics of populationism, the politics of a kind of deeply, at least to me, seductive, tentacular interconnectedness rhetoric that seems somehow to always end up shying away from naming class, and in particular the necessity of class war, and a bit of an allergy, I'll be honest, to the politics of chthonic beings and goddesses. But after I published my critique of the Make Kin Not Babies slogan in Viewpoint magazine in 2017, Haraway herself told me in person that I thought I wasn't an ecofeminist, but I was and am an ecofeminist. Yes, I said, yes, I think you are right. So with Haraway and with Battistoni then, I firmly believe that it is possible to be an ecofeminist without, for example, reinforcing gender dualism. Alyssa says in an interview about this ecofeminism coinage, quote, I actually think ecofeminism often gets a bad rap for essentialism. At some point, the perception that ecofeminism was all goddesses and earth mothers took over, and people started distancing themselves from ecofeminism as a descriptor. Frankly, I think the uncoolness of ecofeminism also has to do with the very thing it seeks to address, the idea that environmentalism and feminism are silly and not politically serious. There are strains of ecofeminism that are much more critical and expansive, as Geneviève and Fatima have evoked. Like other feminisms, contemporary ecofeminisms engage with intersectionality, post-coloniality, indigeneity, queerness, and other thinking that complicates the idea of womanhood. These kinds of ecofeminism can help us think through ways of abolishing gender in our relationship to the earth, unquote. So let me quickly wrap up by giving two little examples. My hope is that by giving a couple of concrete instances of 20th century Haraway in disagreement with 20th century Haraway, I can help unpack a little bit what might be at stake in Battistoni's endeavor to hybridize and perhaps eventually abolish the opposition between xenos and oikos in feminist theory and praxis, an endeavor I clearly believe to not be a merely semantic issue, but genuinely worthwhile, because it matters, to paraphrase the great anthropologist Marilyn Strathern, what words we use to world our worlds. So as I say, I have two nodes of ecofeminist tension between the alien and the family that I want to spotlight, which are essentially two moments of generative disagreement between Haraway and herself. So first, in the mid-80s, the Cyborg Manifesto famously declared a preference for cyborgs over goddesses, right? Though both are bound in the spiral dance, she concluded, I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess. And then in contrast, but without commenting on her defection to the other side, as it were, Haraway's work from the mid-2010s hangs all of its ethico-political injunctions explicitly on invocations of the goddess, right? Chthonic deities from cultures all around the earth. Quote, you know, the 10,000 names of Gaia, Terra, Cthulhu, quote, the diverse earth-wide tentacular powers and forces and collected things with names like Naga, Gaia, Tangaroa, burst from waterful Papa, Terra, Hanyasu, Hime, Spider Woman, Pachamama, Oya, Gorgo, Raven, Akalajusi, and many more. These are mother deities that belong to specific places, lands, rivers, mountains, and yes, nations, albeit indigenous nations rather than nation states. And, you know, like the Haraway of the Cyborg Manifesto, I am not remotely matrophobic about these mother deities. I hope it was clear in Full Surrogacy Now, which was a sort of paean to gestational creativity, full of, you know, deep admiration for the arts of mothering against motherhood. I'm not against these goddesses in as much as their magic, their force queerly exceeds the patriarchal containers of motherhood and indeed godhood. I simply prefer cyborgs because the concept of the cyborg inscribes the unfinished, in progress, wounded, migrant, fugitive character of the gendered human. So I favor the cyborg still because of my commitment to countering xenophobia in all of its forms. For instance, you know, in the anti-Semitic thought meme that historically runs through environmentalist thought and its eugenicism in history, that valorizes and sentimentalizes the native, the autochthonous, and the indigene over the refugee or the migrant, and distrusts and vilifies so-called rootless cosmopolitanism, right? I do not reject the goddesses assembled so much as being simply unpersuaded by their analytic use in staying with the trouble. I'm agnostic ultimately, but for now, unconvinced, and made suspicious, as I wrote in my review, specifically by the strange oscillation in Staying with the Trouble, in and out of avowal and disavowal of the name of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu. A Cthulhu without one extra inaudible H that she symptomatically asserts, quote, plays no role for me. I will say with immense respect that in her reply to my criticism in a letter in the London Review of Books, following an essay by Jenny Turner that quoted me, Haraway gracefully embodied the responsibility she has so powerfully theorized throughout her work, expressing her frustration and even her anger at those who call her arguments racist, quote unquote, without, however, pushing us away. There are not many people on earth who could or would do that. So in respectful and comradely disagreement and ongoing responsibility, I'm ultimately hoping to suggest that the challenge remains whether we plump for cyborgs or goddesses in the end, to understand that goddesses were perhaps always already cyborgs all along, in the sense that they emerged as historical relations from an always already impure and contaminated material earth system. The challenge remains to grasp the nettle of the contingent homelessness that we all suffer, all of us, as subjects of capitalist colonialism, subjectivated in a totalizing fashion by the organized scarcity of the family, the privatization of care in private households. So the goddess cyborg tension might be resolvable, I suspect, only through the smashing of the machine that produces capitalist gender, which is to say, the abolition of the division of labor, including techno-gestational labor, that currently feminizes those who produce life, whether in commodified or uncommodified, waged or unwaged, formalized or invisibilized ways. Sebastian, I don't have time for my second example, do I? Oh, I do?
Yeah, you do. You actually have two to 3 minutes.
Okay, great, thank you. Great, quickly, my second example. Beginning in 2015, Haraway has advocated kin making in contrast to baby making. So in many ways, this call to make kin of a wide array of beings, non-human as well as human, is completely aligned with the politics I advance in Full Surrogacy Now and Abolish the Family, right? In which I demand that human beings learn not just to be the makers of one another, which we already are in, dystopian, stratified, social, laborious, and also cellular, leaky, epigenetic ways, but also crucially, this is the communism part, to act like it, right? Okay, so in a sense, we're on the same team if you are happy to use kin making essentially to mean, comradeliness. But if you want to be a stickler and quibble about the specific word kin, which used to come with an erased other half, kith, K-I-T-H, you might notice, you might begin to care that 2 decades prior, Haraway announced, I'm sick to death of bonding through kinship and the family. And I long for models of solidarity and human unity and difference rooted in friendship, work, partially shared purposes, intractable collective pain, inescapable mortality, and persistent hope. Ties through blood, including blood recast in the coin of genes and information, have been bloody enough already. I believe there will be no racial or sexual peace, no livable nature, until we learn to produce humanity through something more and less than kinship, unquote. So once again, I'm on team earlier Haraway. For me, the kinship value, despite its potentially radical aspiration to encompass the whole world and all the beings in it, is politically unconvincing, an untrustworthy metaphor founded in a fantasy of an immovable ground, right? Nature, blood, gene, seed, potentially even land, for relationships, which ensures an automatic flow of care that only God or the state or death can dissolve. A metaphor that means we do not learn, as we must, I think, to place our trust in contingency, in labor, in the making new, like bread, of our relations to one another via care every day. Because when you drill down to it, blood being thicker than water is always and perhaps inevitably kinship talks central referent. I would like to see ecofeminists make an effort to loosen, unseat, unlearn the thought, the practice, the language of kinship, just as I would like to see a xeno-hospitable return to the cyborg. But ultimately, I want to suggest on a meta level and in this deeply Harawayvian mode, we do not necessarily have to side with one Haraway. When we read Haraway against Haraway, we can be angry with one another and remain comrades. In the spirit of diversity of tactics, I think we can even be friends. Perhaps the delicate relational art of ecofeminism is, in the end, about embracing the meta cyborgicity of being part eco, part xeno. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, for this characteristically generous, constructive, and dialectical critique. I am now leaving the floor to Bettina. To Bettina to introduce our discussant, Nolwenn Bühler.
Yeah, thank you. Will briefly introduce our discussant. Nolwenn Bühler holds a PhD in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Zurich. She's an anthropologist, of biomedicine and health with a background in nursing. She has worked as a senior lecturer in gender studies at the University of Neuchâtel, and her research explores current reconfigurations of public health research and health inequalities and environment health relations. And she has published on reproduction and aging. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments. Nolwenn, please.
Thank you, Bettina, for this introduction. And thank you all for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity to reflect on the relations between theory and activism through the lens of ecofeminist perspectives. So your talks today showed how this field is rich and diverse and productive in generating new questions and troubling categories. The tension between theory and activism is at the core of the field of gender studies, but even more of ecofeminist perspectives, which blur not only this distinction itself, by remaining very much connected to all forms of activism, but also by pushing us to revisit the assumptions and categories upon which gender theories are based. So recently, I have read an older text of Judith Butler, which is the lecture she gave when receiving the Adorno Prize, and which is entitled, Can One Lead a Good Life in a Bad Life? This question resonates particularly for me in regard to the environmental crisis we live in front of the destruction of ecosystem, of global warming, the pollution of our globalized industrial world, the pervasiveness of colonialist, sexist, and extractivist logic at stake in our neoliberal economies, of increasing inequality, structural violence, and the resurge of nationalist and conservatist movement. How can one lead a good life? What is a good life? How can one also bring changes? How beyond the powerlessness in which the scope of the systemic changes that would be needed put us often when the only response that seems sometimes to be left to us is consuming the right products? Can the theoretical resources of gender studies, but also the multiple forms of feminist activism, nourish our answers? There is, of course, no easy and straightforward answer to this question, which raise further political and ethical questions about the definition of life, the mechanism of power that are at stake in the differential values lives are granted and about which lives matters. which do not, and under which circumstances, but also about what makes a life livable and what differentiates a good life from a bad life, under which terms a life is qualified and counted or recognized as livable. Beyond this theoretical aspect, this question is somehow also answered in practices in daily life, in the micro choices one does every day, in the little acts, the ordinary attempts to have the best life possible, in the moral values that guide individuals and their practices to make life livable for themselves and others. So for me today, you all brought some elements of answer about this question by inviting us to think about indigenous worldviews that do not separate human life from the breeding ground that is land, trees, and water for them, about the kind of work that is necessary for subsistence, the activities that are necessary to maintain and repair our world in order to make it livable, but also about the role of families and or kinship as a form of relational network, which is necessary for the perpetuation of life that extends far beyond the biological ties and can also become a site of resistance and transformation. So I have worked, as Bettina said, I have worked on reproduction and reproductive technologies, but my research now has moved to public health issues relating to the impact of environmental health and health inequalities, especially in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is to say that our works in their diversity and richness resonate with several aspects of my work and the questioning I have had or have in my research. So how do we bring together environmental justice and reproductive justice? How do we think about the work of reproduction, about motherhood, kinship in time of environmental crisis? How can we work the tension between nature as a powerful repertoire used to naturalize identities, world, used to essentialize hierarchies of differences, the unequal distribution of care work and its responsibility, and nature as this agentic force, as an ally, as escaping the modernist idea of a blank surface, just there to serve the needs of the human species. How and can ecofeminist critical perspective help us to think about health inequalities and crises? Last but not least, what is the role of academia in front of an environmental crisis that questions the place of politics and ethics at the core of scientific work, the role of academia, its moral responsibility in doing, changing, transforming, but also the ways through which we make critical perspective available for others, the way we share them beyond academic circles. These are some of the questions I have at the moment, into which we can go back later in the discussion. But I would like now to turn to each of you to say a few words about your work and ask specific questions to which you can answer later. And of course, just listening to you and also reading your work in advance raised many questions for me, and you can also just pick one or the other in the discussion later. So Fatima, by telling us the story of Filipinos indigenous people resisting the construction of a dam and of the Indian Chipko movement, both resisting the dispossession of their land, resisting with armed force, but also with their bodies themselves, resisting to make their lives livable. You invited us to reflect about how the indigenous understanding of the relations between natures and humans, which is at odds with the nature-cultural divide, this ontological grid that structures modern thinking and consecrates human exceptionalism over nature, is at the core of their resistance. You also showed us how social movement, our practices of resistance, as opening up new possibilities for women to take a lead role change conceptions of gender roles and differences. So debate in ecofeminism about essentialism or differentialism, or the essentialism that would be underlying ecofeminist perspective, as, or the goddess figure, as Sophie told us. The values at the core of ecofeminist movement reinstate, there is disputed that they reinstate an idealized version of womanhood. And yet in your story, you showed us whether how these women trouble somehow gender categories and how they fight with arms, but also something that struck me in your account, in your narrative or story, is this scene when you present these women going out with their babies in their arms and getting rid of their clothes and making their breast milk kind of sprinkle. So I was curious about how you understand the role of motherhood as a resource for political action or for political activism. And how we can also perhaps how they conceptualize, or how the vision of motherhood in regard to these debates about the biology of motherhood and other kinds of making kin or extended kin relations. Another question I had while reading you is the importance of indigenous knowledge and the closeness or the similarities we can observe between the vision of human nature relations and some of the scholarly work that is done at the moment that problematize the nature-cultural divide, defend that we take into account non-human actors in our sociological accounts and decenter human exceptionalism. But it's like also sometimes in academic sphere we rediscover some knowledge that these, for example, the kind of indigenous people you presented have a long time. So it's like a reappropriation or perhaps a colonization also, I don't know, like of this knowledge. And I was just curious about how you think about the role of this knowledge and the link that can be made with scholarly work in similar question, and how also to recognize and value this kind of thinking. And my last question for you would be, because I saw that you wrote on vulnerability, which is at the core of the ethics of care, and in which vulnerability becomes an intrinsic quality of all lives. Life would be by definition vulnerable and in need of care, but it's also a medical category used to designate situations and groups of people more at risk of suffering from ill health. And I saw that you use also this concept of vulnerability, and I would be very curious, if we have time, to hear you a little bit more about this and how we're thinking vulnerability can be perhaps a resource also for both activist practices and more theoretical thinking about gender and environment. Geneviève, I have to go back to my notes. Geneviève, you brought us to think about how revolutionary practices start from the daily social movements start from the daily practices which resist the commodification of our world and the destruction of biodiversity. You revisited first the division between production and reproduction by showing us how this division was born with the industrial revolution and the development of capitalist economies, by questioning the division or the definition of work and insisting on this distinction between consumer work and subsistence work. You also enable us to criticize this more neoliberal version of feminists, which sees in paid work a form of emancipation for women. What I found interesting in the way you this is a question that relates to your paper, where you describe the alternative ecological agricultural practices, and you describe women who don't recognize themselves as feminists. And for me, the question I would like to ask to you is how ecofem or practices that could be understood or labeled as ecofeminist in a sense do not recognize themselves as feminist. So is it a signal that gender studies somehow or theories lost their connection to this kind of movement? Has it become too theoretical, or how do you see this relation between the theories that you presented to us, the subsistence feminists, and the practices that you observed? I wonder also about somehow the utopian character of these alternative ways of living that you described. I think that more than ever, we need to create new imaginaries for a livable world. We need to reinvent future other than this kind of dystopian destruction narrative. But at the same time, I wonder about the real possibilities of escaping neoliberal logics of capitalist economies. When I read or think about this maisonnée or the kind of way of living or subsistence, of making subsistence, it seems that these subsistence modes are really out of the neoliberal economy. And I think, or at least it seems that one and another are really in opposition, while today I think we are so dependent on these neoliberal systems, to systems that we criticize, but at the same time that we cannot live without. So I would really like to hear more about this interdependency that we have to these economic systems. And another examples I would have, more concrete, is that in your work on these subsistence practices, it seems that much of them are farmers and peasants, or they work the earth, the land. And in Switzerland, for example, what I observed in a small project on the understanding of chemical exposure among farmers or the agricultural community, is that as long as these farmers cannot make a living for their families and for their subsistence, it is very hard or not possible or even imaginable for them to give up on the productivist norms that oriented practices, to give up, for example, on pesticides. And yeah, I would be really interested to hear you about this tension, and if you observe it also in France. And the last question would be about motherhood, and I also saw that you work on doula and alternative ways of giving birth. And for me, what I observe in regard to this environmental crisis is more like an increase in the maternal responsibility, the maternal moral duty to create a kind of safe space, avoiding buying organic food, I do say cooking all by yourself, to protect in the name of the future health of the child. And there is really this moral responsibility and this huge work of care that is carried by mothers. And I wonder about the distribution of this care work that you observed in this maisonnée. Like, is it really gender, does it really, does it not reproduce the gender division of labor? And to this extent, it seems a little bit utopian to me, but I would really like to hear you about that. And last, for Sophie, I really love, thank you so much for your beautiful talk. And I think I'm still thinking very much about it, and I have to digest. I mean, Harari is not easy to read, and listening to you, it's like I would need also more time to really digest all the conceptual subtleties you brought in. But yeah, I just wrote some question. I really liked how you brought us to think about this tension between the Harari of the 2090s, let's say, and the Harari of now, which writes about making not population. And I also really like how you invite us to somehow not only we think kinship, we appropriate kinship in a way that extends that extends to non-human animals or species, the web of care that is present in kinship. But and for me, I still work with this concept of kinship, and because I have the impression that it's also good to work with this concept to debiologize it. And you really, if I understand, you really invite us to reject the concept itself of the and family as a concept. And I'm very I just have to see the question I had.
Well, Nolwenn,
yeah.
Fatima said she has to go because it's very late at her place. But thank you very much for this.
Okay.
Very
so I leave up the last
already.
question, and we can go back to it in the discussion. Thank you.
I'll leave the floor to Bettina, but I suggest perhaps, given that it's already 6 p.m., that perhaps we we let the speakers just make a last comment or answers to some of the questions you asked, but also some of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A, some of which have been very eloquently answered already, but some of the audience wouldn't know already. Just perhaps if Fatima wants to say something and is still here, we could start with Fatima. If you want to say a last word.
Sorry, it's 1 o'clock. I'm sorry. Actually, yeah, those are really very insightful, Nolwenn. And there's a lot really, but I just can't, I want to do justice to your reaction, but there is no time. So I just would like to say thank you so much, and I hope we can continue the conversation in another venue or through email. Thank you so much. Actually, I was really interested in your comment, in your question about motherhood, because it's really one of my one of the big issues for me. The idea that I don't know if you recall, or you remember the Abu Ghraib prison abuses. You do? Just 2 minutes, because I really was hoping that the participants can join in the discussion, Sebastian. My students actually wanted to participate, but I think we don't have it. I would just like to acknowledge also the presence of my colleague, Associate Professor John Ponsaran, who raised.
It looks Fatima's been disconnected. Just in case she reconnects later, perhaps Geneviève wants to say a last word in order to answer some of the questions by Nolwenn and also by the.
Yeah, thank you very much for all your comments, and I will be short because I know everybody is might be tired. So I would be very short. That since I am a sociologist, and also I try to do series about ecofeminism, but for me it was very interesting to see that I could have observe and live with people who are in the making of a new world right now, and actually their best way of theorizing is just to give me a taste. I mean to give me a taste of their life without words. So yes, gender studies are not very helpful in some ways, because they actually demonstrate that some parts of gender studies and ecofeminism are already absorbed in their way of living. So actually, since they cannot live outside of industry, I really tried. I mean, they live in a close interdependency. What they want to show is how to choose, how to try to avoid or to make good hybridation. Is really a major concern. So maybe I will stop here. But to speak with Sophie Lewis, actually, Ecofeminism actually for me is very already something that in a way is absorbed in this very strange idea which consists in living with your fireplace, with handmade things and a portable a cell phone and computer and a car and herbs, so it's a very mixed technologically hybrid world, but they want to show what good hybridations they can make without for those not destroying the living world. That's all.
I will just very briefly.
Go ahead, Sophie.
Yeah, I will just briefly respond and say thank you to everybody for their brilliant contributions. But I very much agree with that, and I think listening to your talk as well, Geneviève, I was struck by I think we're in agreement that the task, in a sense, like you just said, is sort of which hybridizations, because with the hybridization is perhaps inevitable and always already there. This is the cyborgicity thesis. I guess you can just translate it almost. I think they're almost synonymous, really. Yeah, and in a sense, that's what I sometimes find missing. Well, this is all very theory and abstract, and I agree with you too that perhaps the thing to benefit most from is the showing through action in struggle, which perhaps was mainly in Fatima's contributions today, of the always already sort of hybridized sort of assaults with choices about which worlds we want to world, the dark side of care politics, which I think is not very well understood in the global north, but I believe in other parts of the world is better understood. The sort of the need to specifically unmake certain types of relations, certain types of world, in fact, to stop caring for certain kinds of household, in fact. So there's always a politics, a choice there. And sometimes I find we lag behind in academia, saying care in a very romanticizing way, as though the only thing we need is sort of more care, more care, more care, rather than the difficult political question of care for what, why, So with those rather self-evident remarks, I'll just say thank you, and that it was great to participate here today.
Very, very useful remark, and thank you very much, Sophie. Thanks to all the speakers, to Nolwenn for discussing, but also to Elena, Dominique, and Dominique for helping us put this panel together. It was very fruitful. We also thank the audience that was here live and that will be here for the recorded version of this roundtable. And we will say goodbye, but also see you in a year with another roundtable by the Swiss Society for Gender Studies. Thank you very much. Good day, good night, good afternoon, depending on where you are at this moment. From Bettina and I. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.